Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me.
Well, for those of you joining us online, welcome to this service as well. I'm Jason, one of the pastors here, and we are starting a brand new series today on the book of Ruth for the next 4 weeks that is a part of our journey through Lent. Lent in the Christian calendar is a period of time leading up to Easter. It's 40 days, and its purpose is to kind of get us prepared for the Resurrection Sunday celebration that is the Super Bowl of our faith. And one of the things that we do during this process of Lent, which Brandon told us last week, means the lengthening of days. Aren't you glad that every week you can feel it? Days are getting longer and longer. Here's some bad news for you. Next week is daylight savings time again. Can you believe this? I love the impact of it. I just hate, we just got our kids ready for going to bed at this time. But anyway, the time period of Lent is this great opportunity for us to search for God like good investigators. And we're doing two things when we investigate this time. The first is that we're looking at ourselves. We are evaluating kind of introspectively, choosing to look at ourselves and go, where is it that I need growth? Where am I not lining up and looking like the picture of Christ? That's our job. We're supposed to live into and become little Christs. That's what a Christian is. So we look for those places where we're still broken so that on Sunday morning of Easter, we celebrate what God has done for us in a really, really powerful way. But the other thing that we're doing is we're looking for little traces of God's presence and His love for us right now. And it's this great opportunity to use the everyday things of life to see how God feels about you. That's what we're going to do with this book of Ruth. Now, Ruth is a really short book. It's 4 chapters. It's less than 100 verses. You can read it every day for the next several weeks and probably gain a lot from that. But I encourage you to read along with us every week. At least read the chapter that we're on. And you'll find that it's constantly pointing ahead to Christ. You need to know something about the time period in which Ruth was written. It's actually considered one of the literary masterpieces in the world of any type of literature. It's an incredible book, super tight, concise. It's got tragedy, it's got humor, it's got redemption, it's got character development. It's really incredible how it was done in that way, and it always points us to Jesus. Here's what's happening. When the book is written, the people of Israel are in a period of time that we call the period of the Judges. It's before they received a king and they have their kind of monarchy, their theocracy that's going with God installing the king. And what they're experiencing is a time that is just dark. It's a time of violence. It's a time of pandemic-like plagues across the earth. It's a time of famine and lack and economic insecurity. It's a time of moral relativism where there's no absolute. In fact, the words of Judges themselves say that in that time, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Does any of this sound familiar? We're living in a similar kind of moment where on one sense, you look at the backdrop of the world and you could go, man, it is really dark. How are we getting out of this? And with that as the backdrop, there's some beauty in Ruth that shines through, not just for then, but for you and me today. And so I want to start you today by looking at this very first chapter and point out a theme that's going to carry through the entire book. It's a kind of love that we see over and over again displayed in this book, and it's the kind of love that Christ has for us. So I want to show you what this love is. I want to show you why it matters that we have it, and then how to get it as we approach the communion table together at the end of our time. Here's how Ruth begins, in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to skip around a little bit, tell you the story, we'll read some scripture, and then I'll make some points and some comments about it as we go. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, now you know what that means, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, Moab is the enemy territory. Moab is a place where the people that were Moabites had come from a really, really nasty story in the history of the people of Israel. Abraham's cousin Lot had had this incestuous relationship with one of his daughters, and the people came from that. And they were considered other, they were considered outsider, they were considered beyond the reach of God, and they were never to be messed with. But it's so bad and they're so hungry in the place that they live where the famine has happened that they all choose to go as far as they could, and that would even include a place that God had surely forgotten. Verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. So off goes Elimelech with his wife and his two good-looking boys off to Moab to try to find food. They get there, and the boys marry Moabite women, two ladies, one named Orpah and one named Ruth, and they begin their life in this place. But tragedy strikes, and Naomi's story really is just a picture of one tragedy after another. First, her husband Elimelech dies, and then after they've been there for around 10 years, both of her sons die. And she's left with just her two daughters-in-law, no male in the family. Now, some of you are going like, power to the women, that's okay. But in that culture, that would be a really difficult situation. You would be vulnerable without a male or without a male heir. And apparently, the marriages to Orpah and Ruth between the sons didn't result in any children. So Naomi, who's now a widow, has no grandkids and no sons, and is hungry, and is in enemy territory, and everything in her life looks like it is just disaster. Can you kind of feel that? Can you get the sense of the darkness, not just that's happening overall, but that's happening in her world? And she hears news from back home in Judah. It says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, so God somehow in the midst of a global famine began to feed the people of Israel, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. And then Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, look, go back each of you to your mother's home. You really should not come with me. May the Lord show you kindness as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. She basically looks at the situation and says, I don't know why God has been so mean to me, but you guys should not come with me. Clearly, there's an issue. You should go home to your own people, marry somebody else, have kids. You're going to be fine. This is my burden to bear. One of the sisters, Orpah, she listens to Naomi and says, that sounds pretty smart. I think I'll do that. She gives her a kiss and she heads back home. The other daughter, Ruth, she has a different approach. We don't exactly know why. We don't know if it's because she's seen something in the character of Naomi over their time or she's heard about Naomi's God, but something in her causes her to reply like this. Verse 16, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Wherever you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. This is a vow. This is a statement of faith, not only in Naomi, but in the God of Naomi. By choosing to say, your God will be mine, this is like her confession. Like we all just went through a confession that we put up on the screen and said earlier, this is her moment to confess faith in Yahweh God, but it's also her moment to attach herself to Naomi. And this is the example of love that I want to show you. It's a Hebrew word, and the Hebrew word for it is called chesed. I said that pretty well this time, first service. It was terrible. Did not sound like a Hebrew at all. But chesed love is a particular kind of love. In fact, it's the only kind of love that God knows. Paul Miller, who's a therapist, a writer for families, and psychologist, in his book, The Loving Life, wrote this, that Hesed is love without an exit strategy. I love that. It's loyal love. It's covenantal love. It's steadfast love. It's love without an exit strategy. I was thinking about how many of us really want to make sure we always have an exit strategy. Is there anything that you've done, bought, a relationship you've started in the last few years that you didn't first consider what's my way out before you got in? Anybody? I didn't think so. We have this fear of commitment. Okay, well, we have one. But for most of us, we always are waiting for an exit strategy or looking for one when we engage. Now, I used to do work in a financial services world, and we helped businesses plan their exit strategy. And in business, that's a real good thing. When you are planning to sell out and kind of grow something and then cash out and move on, you need an exit strategy. That's important. But we engage this in all kinds of ways in life. Like, how many of you signed up just once for a trial run for razors, groceries, vitamins, and you're still getting them because you couldn't figure out the exit strategy? Am I the only one that gets a box delivered about once a week with something? I don't know how to get out of it because they make the unsubscribe like so small at the bottom. We need exit strategies for so many things. We need exit strategies. Right now, the average American has 4 streaming service subscriptions and 4 other subscriptions to either boxes or services. That's us. This is proof that we can't get out. 43% of workers, according to Deloitte, in a report that just was out last week, 43% of workers who accept a job, accept the offer, within 2 weeks will renege on that because something better came along. This is the level of commitment phobia that we have. And it's not just in business. It's not just on Instagram. It's also in our relationships. One of the most fascinating things right now that I think is like emblematic of this issue is there is a status that's now being used in culture between whenever you first start dating and when you're fully involved, like all the way in, and it's called, anybody know it? A situationship. Look it up, situationship. I think that is just really, really cool and interesting. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying that it makes sense to me. And here's why. Because so many people have learned that people leave, they don't keep their promise, they don't keep their commitment, and I'm not sure I want to go all in on this right now. But I don't want us to just still be in the talking phase. I'm just not ready to go to the full relationship phase, so we do a situationship. And what's interesting to me is that I think this is so often what we think about God too. We have a fear of commitment, partially because we think something better might come along. Swipe left, maybe the next one's better looking, the next job offer that comes, or we're afraid that we might do something that causes us to be held to our commitment to stay in. And if things aren't happy or things don't look like the way we want an exit strategy. And we think that God does the same thing. There's a verse of scripture that I use a lot as a call to worship. You've heard me say it before. And it's this verse. It comes from Lamentations chapter 3. It says, the steadfast love, and that's our word, hesed, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Isn't that beautiful? That should go on a coffee cup or a Christian bookstore calendar, January page. I mean, it is so good. Here is the question that I have for you. Do you believe it's true? I see people like, I'm not sure if he's asking a real question. And I think what's partly behind that is you're not sure if you believe it either. I know a lot of you would say that, no, I do. I totally believe that. And we all want to believe that. This is the kind of love we want, not just for us, but we want to give to someone else too. That scripture verse was actually written by the prophet Jeremiah at a time when the people of Israel were in exile. Their situation and circumstances looked really, really bad from the outside. Kind of like Naomi. When she gets back to Judah, we're told that the people who remember her, they come to her and they're like, Naomi, oh, it's so good to see you back. This is great. And she's like, don't call me Naomi. Maybe not quite that firm. Naomi, that name means pleasant or happy or blessed, and I'm none of those. Clearly, God's got it out for me. You should call me Mara. That means bitter. And she looks at the circumstances and believes that that's evidence for what God thinks about her. She actually says, God's done all this stuff to me. Now, I remember a couple of moments in my life where I felt like the circumstances of my life were the evidence for whether God loved me or not, too. And maybe you can resonate with this. One of them is right after 9/11. I remember when that took place, I was working at a straight commission sales job, and our bosses didn't take any time to let us know that they were sure that the world was going to take a while to come back, and so we got laid off. I think it was September 13th. All of us were told, you're done. So there's not a lot of going to get another job at that moment. I'm out of a job. It had already been a rough quarter. I remember there was some stuff going on in my family and relationships. And I end up, just a month or so later, living in this tiny little basement apartment with no light coming in, just me and my thoughts about how bad the world was and how bitter I felt. And I remember asking the question, like, God, if you loved me, anybody? There's another reason that we sometimes doubt God's love for us, the steadfast love of God. Sometimes it's our circumstances, sometimes it's our own performance. Because we actually believe that his love is kind of like the love we've received from a spouse who walked out on us, or a relationship that went badly, a friendship that dissolved over something that was ridiculous. And that's we believe that we have to perform or live up to a standard for God to keep loving us. And that happened to me too. It just happened kind of earlier. I grew up in the church. My mom made sure that my brother and I knew God and knew Christ and knew the church. And I've shared a little bit of this story with you before, but I knew all of that. I really got church game too. Like I had it down. I knew how to play it, how to look right, how to say the right things, show up, which things were important to go to and which didn't matter. But about 16, 17 years old, I felt like I was living two lives. Like there was the one that nobody at the church would have guessed, like who I really was. I had all the old ladies fooled. They loved me. And then there was the me that nobody knew, except for me. And I was leading an FCA group. Any of you FCA people, right? Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I'm leading this group, and I'm a junior in high school, and I'm sitting down with all these athletes one early Tuesday morning, and I'm thinking like, I am the biggest imposter. I'm such a fraud. If they only knew. And at that moment, I don't know that it happened logically or cognitively at that exact moment, but over the course of the next little while, that was kind of a turning point where I began to say, well, maybe if God knows this about me, he can't be okay with me either. And so what happened is, instead of facing what I thought was rejection from God, I rebelled and pushed him away and ran. And that started a pattern of just like running away from God for years. Does anybody know that story? You got your own, right? If I had only realized at the time that God's love for me was not like the love that I expected to come from people, but it was this hesed love, this covenantal, loyal, faithful, unending, no exit strategy love, I think it's possible that I would have done something different. I could have actually experienced the freedom of saying like, hey, this is me and I need help. But instead I had to go into hiding. The steadfast love of the Lord that never ceases, it actually gives us freedom. It's just hard for me to believe that God doesn't have an exit strategy with me. And then I look at what we're going to do today in celebrating the communion table. And I'm reminded that he did not have an exit strategy. He didn't have a way out. He was fully committed. This wasn't a situationship with Jesus and you. He's all in. Just like Ruth was to Naomi. There's this other passage of scripture that we repeat a lot, Psalm 136. Some of you will know this. Psalm 136 has like 52 lines, and 26 of them repeat the same phrase over and over. The steadfast love of the Lord, the hesed love of the Lord never ceases. Now, it's kind of interesting, especially for those of you who don't like modern worship music. I assume because you're here that you're good with it. But some people they really don't like it because they call it 7-Elevens. Have you heard this phrase? That it's 7 words we just repeat 11 times. And that's what worship is now. But here's the thing. In Psalm 136, it's 7:26. The author has us repeat over and over and over and over again ad nauseum, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. He doesn't make us repeat that God's greatness or his holiness or any of those other things, and it's not because they're not true. It's because we don't have much trouble believing that. We've got to get reminded of the surprising nature that God doesn't have an exit plan for your love. Isn't that cool? So if you don't like 7-Elevens, blame it on God. He did it first. This kind of love is not, I love you because, ... It's because I love you, ... This is the way God interacts with us all the time. And Hesed love combines that idea of love with this commitment. It's unending. It's always between two parties, and it's practical. Hesed love has behind it action. It always costs something. It always costs the lover something. Because when we choose to love this way, we actually limit ourselves. Have you ever thought about this? At a wedding, you literally walk down like a narrow way, the aisle to get to the front. That's a picture of the limiting of choice. When you love like this, in covenantal love, you choose to say, I am going to slowly narrow my life in what feels like a limiting so that I can actually experience abundance in my soul and heart, in the relationship. I'm going to choose to not do certain things so that I can fully experience this love. That's why this kind of love is so powerful. It's why we need it. It's why it matters. And this is what Ruth did with Naomi, somebody that she didn't have to. In fact, logic, realism said you should have run the other way. But she chose to go all in. And the reason that this kind of love is important for you and I to be able to cultivate is this. When we love someone else with Hesed kind of love, we offer them freedom. Because you know what most of us do? We love in a way that even though we want it to be unconditional, it really depends on how the other person is either receiving or responding to that love, don't we? Like, we choose to maybe take the action, but then when they're not doing it right, to come back, we start to pull back. And it actually ends up in not having freedom for them or for us. I was talking to somebody this week about this idea, and like my personality type is that I am always thinking, and maybe you've felt this way before, about making sure that people are okay. I'm a people pleaser on one hand, recovering people pleaser, and then on the other hand, I'm also like I want to be a helper, and which is really great. Except that then I'm constantly handing people out my scorecard, going, "How am I doing? I mean, not physically, obviously, but that's what I'm thinking. How am I doing? My performance is determining whether I'm valuable or not." That's a terrible way to live. And it's not necessary, which is even better news. Because God's like, no, because I love you, you're mine. When we think about this kind of love, we don't just feel it. We don't just feel Hesed, we do Hesed. And one of the reasons that it's important for us during the Lent season to try to look for this, to try to practice this, to be equipped and empowered to do it, is because in loving someone else this way, we actually experience God. If you feel like maybe you're not sensing his presence, not close to him, if there's something about maybe in your life right now that seems like he's distant, one of the introspective investigations you can take is to see, are you loving people in this kind of Hesed, no exit strategy way? And if you engage that through the power of the Spirit, you'll find that you meet God in really powerful ways. Because love like this always costs us something. It's always sacrifice. It always takes effort. it always comes with pain. If you've really loved somebody, it doesn't matter, as C.S. Lewis said, whether it's a pet or a boy or a girl or a parent, eventually it hurts. Because on this side of eternity, eventually we lose them. But what are your options? Lewis says the other option is to just take your heart and put it away in a box and lock it up and make sure that no one ever gets close, that you don't ever use that with any kind of sacrifice. And what happens in that box is your heart gets stone cold. And it dies. And so we're invited through the power of the gospel, the invitation of Christ, is to not only experience this kind of love, but to give it away. But first, you have to experience it. God has to do it to you before he'll do it through you. And one of the best ways to kind of reset that is the table of communion. It's where we're reminded that when all the chips were down, Jesus said, I'm staying in. I'm not going to fold. This is not a situationship. This is covenant. And so as we approach Easter, I'd love it if you would consider how many times he could have had the option to bail on you, but he didn't. And no matter what your circumstances look like or your resume looks like, the steadfast love of the Lord, it never ceases. Because here's the truth. The Hesed love of God for us, it's not based on our ability to keep being good. It's based on God's ability to keep being God. Do you see that? For him to continue to be who he is, faithful to his character, God is the one that has the responsibility to continue to love you well. And in response to that kind of grace, we live lives of holiness and love of each other.